Politics continued to drive markets and impact the global economic outlook in the first quarter, but the US is now sharing the spotlight with Europe. In the US, the bond market and the equity markets are signaling conflicting messages about the direction of the markets. We also are seeing tensions with North Korea escalate rapidly, something that in fact Alan Greenspan mentioned in late 2016. In Europe, the UK officially triggered the Brexit process in late March. And very recently, Prime Minister Theresa May called for snap elections in early June, expecting a victory would strengthen her hand in Brexit negotiations. The first round of France's presidential election begins on Sunday with a runoff between the two candidates set for May 7, assuming that no candidate wins an outright majority. The outcome will have significant implications for France, the EU, Europe, and really the world. How do you see the global economic outlook? What are the main forces that you think will be driving the global economy over the next decade, and particularly with all the talk about globalization and what people perceive as a reduction in global political cooperation?
What the problem that we have at the moment and have had for quite a while is that productivity output per hour has shrunk to negligible growth rates, not only in the United States, but across Western Europe and indeed throughout the whole developed world. It is very rare that any country has had a productivity increase on average of more than 1% a year, but that's what we're seeing in the overall economic structure across the world, and we're seeing it coming out as a fear on the part of the populace that something is terribly wrong. This is emerging as pure populism because what we're now seeing is what always happens when economic growth in a particular society shrinks below the tolerance level. And we are close to that level in the developed world. And people are responding to it in the way they always respond to it. They look for leaders to tell them how to improve things. Populism is not a philosophy. It's basically a cry for help.
I think, though, if we take a step back, we should also remember that in some ways the global system has adjusted quite well since the crisis 10 years ago in 2007, 2008. And if you take a sort of, an analysis of globalization and where we are, what you see is that, trade as a share of global GDP, having grown quickly, kind of leveled off. It looked as if it was falling for a little bit, but that was, I think, an exchange rate effect and a commodity price effect, which pulled down the value of trade just because commodity prices were falling in dollar terms. But basically, trade is fine. It's not going backwards. Then you've got movement of people, which is sort of growing a little bit, as a share of the global population, the number of people who live outside their country of birth is up a bit on the past, but it's not dramatic. And the thing that's really changed is cross-border financial flows. And when you disaggregate that, what you see is the fall comes from banking, specifically, not from equity flows of various kinds. And secondly, it's concentrated very heavily in Europe and the Eurozone. And what really there was a bubble in cross-border bank financing within Europe and from Europe to the US in the subprime bubble. And that has properly corrected. And regulatory responses, of which Alan is sometimes critical, but I think in this element we might agree that some restraint on this cross-border activity may have been a healthy thing. And so cross-border financial flows, financial globalization, has reduced, but in a good way. And I think what that shows you is that, first of all, globalization is healthy. Second of all, it's just not true that the global elites, that Davos man, has sat there and done nothing, because in the case of cross-border banking, Davos man has imposed new regulations that have restrained it in a sensible way. And so I think that the system has done better in the past year.
You've written, Sebastian, about sort of the China-US confrontations. Obviously, the currency situation has got better, But the confrontation about bilateral trade has obviously been brewing and getting out there, and the tensions are there. So what do you think is going to be happening on China and then, on Korea? Is that something we do need to worry about on both those topics?
Well, on China, I'll say a couple of things. I mean, I was very pleased that President Trump decided not to persist in his view that China was manipulating its currency.
Right.
And the reason I'm pleased is that I do think that currency manipulation is a problem for fair global trade and for avoiding imbalances. China has in the past engaged in manipulation, in my view, but it has not been doing that recently. And if you care about the rules and the norms, you shouldn't disingenuously invoke them when it's not true. So it wouldn't be true to say that they've been manipulating in the last 12 or 24 months. So I'm pleased that President Trump backed off that. But I do think that he senses in his bones, and he's done this for a long time, that China is somehow cheating. And so I don't think this issue of commercial confrontation with China is going to go away. And it's going to express itself instead in arguments about steel subsidies. It's going to express itself in the auto tariff. The Chinese still impose, I think, a 25% tariff on auto imports, which is far above what the US imposes, which I think is 2.5%. There's going to be an argument, I think, coming along with China determined to sponsor a domestic aerospace industry. It's going to try and support that with government procurement directed at Chinese producers. It's going to use export credits to support its own domestic aerospace industry. It will use its whole development finance, the Asia infrastructure. So I think it's, China has ways in a kind of state capitalist fashion of pushing its domestic industrial champions, and that's going to be the focus of conflict with the US.
Alan, on Korea, is that something that is going to go away, or it's going to continue and get worse, you think?
Depends on China. I mean, China can shut down North Korea overnight because virtually, not say all, but the very substantial part of their trade is bilateral with China.
The other topic, obviously, we have to talk about, we've got Sebastian here, is the UK economy. It's been fairly resilient since Brexit. It's done much better, in fact, than we expected. The pound sterling has done much better. The markets have done much better. And UK has now, formally launched its Brexit negotiations. Do you think they'll get done in 2 years? And what will happen to the economy? Is this sort of growth rate that we've seen in the last 12 months indicative of the future?
Well, I think the forecasting mistake, which I was guilty of and many people were guilty of, was to think that markets would respond straight away to Brexit and to bring forward the future chaos that seems likely from the negotiation. And so you'd see an immediate change in consumer spending or in business investment. And that didn't happen. On the consumer side, what happened was that UK households went out and increased debt after the Brexit referendum and sustained spending through debt. That is not sustainable, obviously. And so at some point that's going to turn around. So I expect that both business spending and consumer spending will weaken in the next year, and this delayed effect, the delayed punishment for deglobalizing will then become evident.
And is this June 8th election helping her with her negotiations also with the Europeans, or
I think it has
not?
It has two good effects. First is her personal standing will be enhanced because she will have her own personal mandate. Before she had just inherited the job, now she will have earned it. That's good for her standing, and that's good for her negotiating power. Second thing is she gets more time, as I've just said. She pushes the next election forward. That's good. What people say is good, and what I'm not convinced about, is that by increasing the size of the Conservative Party's majority in Parliament, right now they have 330 seats out of 650. They're expecting it to go to 680 plus or minus. Is that good or is that bad? It depends who the additional 50 Conservative members of Parliament might be. If they are the equivalent of the Tea Party, and they are hardline Brexiters who just want to get out, it could be bad. It was interesting that the UK tabloid press immediately said, eradicate the saboteurs So they're going. The UK tabloids are going to try and turn this election into a way of punishing the softies who don't want to deglobalize fast enough. And if that tabloid press is influential, you could end up with a parliament that skews more towards a hard Brexit, which burns more of our bridges with our trading partners.
France, what's going to happen? That's sort of
Well,
the huge wild card.
France to me is totally horrifying. I mean, France has its first round of its election on Sunday. There is one, to my mind, sensible, rather inexperienced but sensible candidate, Emmanuel Macron. He's sort of the French version of Matteo Renzi, who was the great hope for reform in Italy and then fizzled out a bit. Some people have compared him to Tony Blair, a kind of articulate centrist. Macron is a former Rothschild banker, so he knows a bit about finance, but that doesn't go down so well in the French electorate. Anyway, the point is, he might get a quarter of the vote. The rest of the vote is going to be split amongst a group of people who really, in some cases, are beyond the pale. So, the least bad one is, the classic conservative Fillon, François Fillon. His problem is that he's accused, rather credibly, I think, of having funneled almost $1 million to his family for jobs they did not do. Not a good thing, but he's actually the best of the bunch.
No,
because the other two,
accused of that. Is there any proof?
I think he's formally charged of that. So I mean, there isn't proof. You're right to point that out. But when his own supporters have told him, you should pull out of the race because there is this big cloud over your head, his answer is, France is greater than my mistakes. Doesn't sound like a very passionate denial. So
I heard that.
My assumption is that there may be fire with that smoke. But in any event, he's the least problematic. But the other two include, Marine Le Pen, the far-right populist who would like to pull France out of the euro and out of the European Union, even though she would need the support of the French Parliament, the National Assembly, to call a referendum, and she wouldn't probably get that. She could still create enough trouble to fundamentally destabilize the Eurozone. And then on the other hand, you've got Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is a kind of Hugo Chavez type communist, who doesn't fool around. When you talk about confiscatory tax, I mean, his suggested rate at the margin is 100%. So it takes all hyperbole out of the expression confiscatory tax. He wants to further restrict the French work week. He wants to regulate everything more. He is a really bad news, for a country that's been foundering and which has a government budget deficit which is adding to the debt to GDP ratio every year because it exceeds nominal GDP growth. The last thing France needs is a hardline status like Mélenchon. So 3/4 of the votes are going to go to people who are fundamentally unappealing. It's possible that Macron scrapes through into the second round, and then you have this runoff on May the 7th, and then he wins. Mm-hmm. So that probably is the most likely. Let's give it a 2/3 chance. But when one says there's a 2 in 3 chance of Macron, it means there's a 1 in 3 chance of a really terrible outcome. Right. And that, that's a big tail risk for European cohesion, for NATO cohesion, and for the general stability. I mean, Italy would go next. So I'm quite pessimistic about the cohesion of the Eurozone.